welcome to our roundtable conversation on the impacts of racism on mental health today. This roundtable is part of our Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversation series. And in this initiative, we engage in conversation with guest speakers from diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public on experiences of exclusion and discrimination in Alberta and Canada. The next slide, please. By shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, such as anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and discrimination against Asian communities, amongst other topics, we hope to encourage solidarity amongst groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. This is a community-based initiative, and we welcome ideas and suggestions for collaboration. This online roundtable series is one of the programs hosted by the Center for Race and Culture. Since its establishment in 1993, the Center for Race and Culture, or short CFRAC, was formerly known as the Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people in an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you would like to learn more about current events, projects, or activities, please visit our website or sign up for our newsletter or reach out either to myself or my colleague Mansouri. And we would be very happy to hear from you also for future conversations. You can also use the feedback form, which we will share with you at the end of the session, to share any thoughts or questions you may have with us. Even though we are not gathered in the same physical space, we would like to acknowledge the land that CFRAC occupies on Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the elders past and present who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. At the Center for Race and Culture, we are trying to go beyond a formal land acknowledgement and connect it to our current sociopolitical milieu in Canada and consider our parts as individuals responding to acts of discrimination and moving towards a more inclusive society. Canada has already been dealing with an epidemic amongst its Indigenous youth. First Nations children and teenagers have a depression and suicide rate more than 3 times the average for non-Indigenous peoples, according to government statistics. But the pandemic is adding a layer of risk to young Indigenous lives, and the impact on mental health may linger for years. Mark Miller, Canadian's Minister of Indigenous Services, states that we continue to work to assess mental health needs and ensure that mental health resources, are deployed directly to the growing mental health concerns, which we still can't quantify entirely or acknowledge and measure the impact. And I think we won't know for years what that impact actually was. And while we are all affected by the pandemic in different ways, the reality is that some population groups will have serious, long-lasting, irreversible impacts, which are due to the continued systemic and institutionalized racism in Canada. While dedicated funding toward Indigenous communities is much needed and an important first step, without accountability, dedicated follow-through, and committed efforts to combating existing racism, these funds are really only a drop in the ocean. So here we will just have a very quick poll so that we have a bit of a better idea of who our audience is during these roundtable conversation sessions. So we would like to invite you to please participate in the poll, and this will only take about a minute. And we would be really grateful if you would please share some of your information. Give it a few more seconds. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists to you. First and foremost is Lucy Liu, a Chinese Vietnamese Canadian practicing as an arts therapist, counseling therapist, and artist currently based in I believe that's in Edmonton. My apologies. Her clinical focus has been working with children, adults, and families from urban Indigenous communities and other diverse cultural communities. She has published and presented on art therapy with cultural and Indigenous communities and decolonizing practices, as well as the use of playback theater to process collective trauma. Her current artistic practice has been community-focused, working specifically with her own cultural community and with diverse BIPOC communities. She has been a part of several playback companies in Montreal, Ottawa, and Edmonton, and has used playback as a tool for community dialogue, community expression and sharing, prevention and processing vicarious trauma, and addressing political violence and collective trauma. Our next panelist is Elliott Young, who is a Nihiwa Cree from Ermineskin Cree Nation, one of the 4 nations that make up Musqueam's. Born and raised on Ermineskin, he came to Edmonton to attend University of Alberta, where he completed a Bachelor of Arts in Native Studies degree with a certification in Aboriginal Governance and Partnership. Elliott's career has been focused on policy development and coordination, community engagement, Indigenous relations, and youth engagement. Elliott's motivation is ensuring social issues are addressed through collaboration and engagement of community. Next, we have David Prodan, who works as a Director of Housing and Mental Health Services at E4C. Having worked at E4C since 2010, David has brought his education in creative writing and poetry together with his activist learnings to be a strong advocate for marginalized voices in communities. David is studying towards a Master's of Arts degree in interdisciplinary studies through Royal Roads University with a focus on housing and sustainable community development. Much of his work explores the intersection of mental health and wellness, recovery, arts, culture, social justice, anti-oppression, community building, and trauma-informed practice at social profit organizations and in the healing and helping professions. His volunteer efforts include 10 years as a founding director for national youth group Apathy is Boring, 3 years as president for Heart of the City Music and Arts Festival, 2 years as director with ECO, the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, and founding member, chair of Trauma Informed Edmonton. And finally, we have Soni Dasmohapatra, who is an Edmonton-based consultant who works with individuals, groups, public service institutions, and community agencies to facilitate the development of tools that focus on building inclusive platforms that incorporate strategy, design, wellness, and art for transformative change. She has been a consultant with the United Nations over the past 5 years. Since returning to Edmonton, she has worked with the government of Alberta as a core team member at the Edmonton Shift Lab and was a grants coordinator at the Edmonton Heritage Council. So welcome everyone, and it is my great pleasure now to hand the conversation over to Soni.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And thank you so much for CFRAC for hosting this amazing opportunity. I had a dream of bringing together an amazing panel to talk about mental health and the intersection of racism. And I'm so pleased that Elliott, Lucy, and David are here to share this platform with me. And I'm so happy to invite and welcome all of our participants today. We're excited to be sharing this very important, timely topic with you. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of a framework of how we will be sort of looking at this question of the intersection of mental health and racism. And then we'll move into a conversation with Lucy, David, and with Elliott as well. So I'd like to start by actually defining mental health, because often that's a good place to start because different people have different notions of what mental health means. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with normal stresses of life, and can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Mental health is more than the absence of mental disorders. Mental health is an integral part of health. There is no health without your mental health, in fact. And mental health is determined by a range of socioeconomic, biological, and environmental factors. Mental illness is different, right? So I'll go on to define mental illness because sometimes those terms get thrown around and are a little bit intersecting, but they have different meanings. So mental illnesses are characterized by alterations in thinking, mood, or behavior associated with significant distress and impaired functioning. The Canadian Public Health Association defines specific mental illnesses such as mood disorders, depression, anxiety, personality disorders, substance dependency, and gambling. So I think it's really important for us to make a really clear distinction about mental health and how every day we impact different ebbs and flows of mental health, impacting our day, our where we interact, our relationships, the way that we function in society. I also like to talk about the social determinants of health because I think it's an important framework to understand that we have biological health, we have physical health, but also within the context of social determinants of health. Basically, there are social and economic factors that influence our health, and they are based on living and working conditions that people experience every day. And social determinants of health can improve, like impact people in positive and negative ways. So some examples are wealth disparity in terms of income and wealth. Um, and in Canada, there's actually 14 social determinants of health that have been defined by Dr. Denis Raphael, which are housing, access to education, income, employment, and actually race is recognized as one of the 14 social determinants of health, which brings us back to this particular piece of how we understand race and its impact on mental health within a social determinants of health framework. And as Miriam spoke about systemic racism, that is impacting another layer of the way that we can understand the ecosystem of mental health and racism. So there are legislations, policies, programs, and media that contribute to systemic racism. So legislations that have are embedded in our laws and our ways of being, policies in our employment areas or in our different ways that we access social services, programs as well, and the media. So one example that I would like to share recently is there was a controversial topic that just recently emerged around the spread of COVID and scapegoat in certain communities, whether they be Asian, South Asian. These are all impacts of systemic racism and how different communities experience them in different ways. Furthermore, when we talk about Indigenous communities, like murdered and missing Indigenous women is another systemic racism um, topic that we can look at as impacting mental health in different ways. And also when we talk about individual racism, so experiencing discrimination individually because of your race, microaggressions that you might experience every single day, like, oh, um, how you're at a workforce and maybe somebody might make some comment about your background that is not appropriate, and in fact contributes to the act of othering. Um, it has been scientifically proven that when people experience or witness acts of racism, their nervous system gets disrupted, right? So your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system actually disrupt, and those kinds of triggers can actually lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma in the future, depending on how much racism you've experienced or seen. So this is not a light topic to take casually. There really needs to be a lot of work done to understand the multi layers of the way that these things impact individuals and systems. And I think that when we look at design of spaces, so one of the things too is like when you are entering a space, do you feel included? Do you feel excluded? Are there guidelines or just emotional cues or places that are made safe for all people to feel included? Or is there still an exclusion because of the way that we're structured as a society? So let's be honest, like when we look at the history of racism in Canada, we can understand that prior uh, acts of legislation that were exclusionary in immigration, the Chinese head tax or Canadian journey legislation or the Black Order and Council, or even the current Indian Act, as we understand it, are still legislative and pack different ways of how communities deal with their mental health and feeling sense of belonging and inclusion. Racial profiling is another way that we might also understand these impacts. So I think that when we move into our discussion, we have excellent panelists today. Elliott, who comes from Ms. Baucus, who is from the Norquest College, who has a really good background in understanding a whole like lifespan of mental health from young people all the way to older generations. Lucy, who is using art and third space playback theater as a powerful tool to heal communities. And David, who is working with housing, which is a social determinant of health, but how does that impact people's like need of belonging in terms of mental health as well. So without further ado, I have a series of questions and we're going to have just a really nice fireside chat today because we are virtual and I have not seen my colleagues in a long time. So I'll just imagine that they're in my living room and I have the fireplace going and we're having some nice tea and talking. So I'll start with the first question. The first question is, can you please define individual and systemic forms of racism in your profession and how this impacts society's mental health, you, your community, and the stakeholders you serve? So I guess anybody can go first. I'm not going to hold it. So please go ahead, whoever feels compelled to start with this question.
I guess I'll jump in to start. So I work as a director of housing and mental health at E4C, and in the work that we do, we try very hard to implement anti-oppressive practice and trauma-informed practice in what we do. But there are still so many instances and systemic structures that bear racism in their DNA. So things that I can think of really specifically in my area would be housing, first and foremost, in and of itself is a bit of a racist construct based on capitalist exploitation of land. And so the fact that we've taken that land from the original inhabitants here in Canada is in and of itself a fully racist construct. But then when we're kind of bringing it to more of the operational level in terms of systems, we think about landlords. E4C is both a landlord and a provider of supportive housing and a provider of housing first services. And so all of these programs that are funded through government or government subsidies themselves have some real tangible institutional racism built into them. We've got the legalese of signing a lease, which is problematic for people whose first language isn't English. And then in practice, there are many occurrences where there's denial of service. And even in my own organization, some staff still adhere to old ways of doing things, and we're trying really hard to change that. But not that long ago, there was an experience that really shook me, that in my own organization, someone said that they were concerned to rent one of our units to single Indigenous women because in the past, those particular units of housing had been targeted by the Red Alert street gang here in Edmonton. And even though there may have been concern and genuine interest in taking care of those women, in and of itself, that process is racist. The way that she mentioned it, the fact that it was built into her bias, it really shook me. And it's something that we're continuously trying to change. So yeah, I think institutionally in the housing sector, there's so many different ways that racism really impacts the way that we offer that service.
Thank you, David. You bring up important points of power, privilege, and processing racism as you experience it. Elliott?
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm going to take a very similar approach as David in saying that education for Indigenous people, the education system, is inherently and historically racist and oppressive, and at times very violent, and that the step away from, or the step towards making education safe for Indigenous people is not, it's not quite there yet. There's still many examples of individual and systemic racism within education institutions, including Norquest. most recently, we had one that happened with Black students with the nursing program that came from Students for Change. That is one example. There's other ways that I think about it individually from both as an employee of Norquest, but also as a student of Norquest, the challenges that racism has, and the space that an educational institution has to provide safety. And that if there is an experience of racism, individual racism, currently we're not set up as a way of providing a safe space to share those concerns, to share that piece of racism, or that experience of racism. Not saying that totally we aren't, but we're not doing a good job. Systemically, there are barriers for accessing education. And again, Norquest is not an exception to this. We are doing work to address those barriers, very much on the socioeconomic side of, and even with Norquest of being a very low barrier, non-competitive school, in the sense of if you meet the minimum requirements, you get in. But there's some programs that, because they're so popular, like our PN program, it is so popular that it fills up in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But there were certain barriers in that didn't allow some BIPOC community members, especially ones that are experiencing poverty, the ability to compete in that process. Not everybody has, how much is our application fee? I think our application fee is $95. And then once you're successfully applied, you then have to put a $400 tuition deposit down. Not everybody, especially at the starting of your schooling, has $495 laying around to get yourself into the door of an educational institution. So we're working on that, and we actually waived the tuition deposit waiver, waived the application fee. So we're making access to education easier for Indigenous students. But there's still impacts of racism within classrooms, within the institution itself, within processes that we have within the college. So there's pieces that are very microaggressions of racism, but also some that are just outwardly, where there be some instructors calling out on BIPOC students to give examples or asking them to share their story. I think many of us have that same feeling, and I'm not immune to it. It's interesting when you talk about being a student and being like, yeah, just speak up, tell your professor that you're like, that's not right. But that happened to me in my last fall in my grad studies. It was, the prof specifically asked me to share something about elders, and I'm like, well, I don't have the authority to. And he's like, well, if you did, what would you say? And I'm like, like, what are you doing? I'm like, you're pushing me so much. But when you're put in that spot, it's really interesting how, your reaction isn't the way that you would necessarily hope it would be. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to take up too much more time, sorry, but the other piece around how racism is impacting, especially with institutions, I'm sure there's other areas that are seeing this, but to move towards anti-racism and anti-racist initiatives, and the amount of energy this takes from BIPOC community members, and especially BIPOC staff. But I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll let Lucy share as well.
And we can just keep going on to find how racism comes into our work, hey? I'll share my two hats. So I'm a therapist, and I see people individually, and most of the work I do right now in private practice is I work with Child and Family Services, and I also work with the Kakiao program on collaborative service delivery with Bentayr healing society, traditional healing society. So I wear a couple hats in that I work for the system, and then I work with children who are in care, Indigenous and diverse children and youth. And I see the systemic barriers because on the one hand, I am a part of a system as a service provider perpetuating the cycle of colonial impacts on Indigenous communities. You know, there's more Indigenous youth and children in care now than there were in the 60s scoop. And so inherently just being a part of that system, I sometimes feel that I'm part of that systemic racism. And so when I finally get to see youth in counseling, you know, art therapy is a way to be inviting for people to share what's going on for them. And sometimes even the request for therapy is, you know, they might define it in a way of saying, well, they need to help support their mental health because they've been removed from their families. And then you're asking that individual to deal with the weight of historical trauma. It's a disjunct, right? You know, why is this child acting out? Why is this youth not wanting to go to school? Well, they have this weight on them. And oftentimes they don't know how to name it. So when that shows up in counseling and therapy, part of my work, coming from a feminist perspective, is helping them define and externalize what they're feeling internally, the impact of racism, how it feels inside their body, and how often as young people and as adults, we tend to internalize it and kind of make it our own. Like, this must be me. The way I feel must be something wrong with me. And so part of my work as a therapist is externalizing, going, yeah, no, you're a part of a system, and this is not right. You shouldn't be removed from your families. You shouldn't be separated and not having a connection with your families. The other things that are harder to see systemically too is, you know, although Alberta has moved towards keeping youth and children within kinship care, there's still a lot of foster families that are not of the same culture, and usually white settler families, and well-meaning, but they also keep people from their culture too, because they don't necessarily have the background and knowledge to understand how to make those connections happen. So we have systemic forms of oppression continuing to perpetuate that remove people from their culture and their connection to themselves, and to throw the bandage of therapy on it, you know, doesn't highlight all the systemic barriers that need to happen and change for that person to feel safe and to feel able to share what's going on and to deal with their mental health. And so my little piece I do individually is to help them see that they can handle the part that belongs to them, and the stuff that doesn't belong to them, well, we can work together collectively to help make that change happen. So that's my individual piece. And then the theater work that I do is to deal with the collective piece, because I think it's good to deal with the mental health issues individually in therapy, but we also need to feel this collective sense of like, oh, wow, you're going through the same thing I am? Yeah, the relief of externalizing what's going on for us. And so in my third space playback theater company, we're a BIPOC theater company that uses playback theater, which is a form of improvised theater where people tell their stories and then we play them back on the spot through improvised theater. We have a fabulous group of people who are therapists, who are activists, who are academics, and who are really, really interested in, you know, the question that you had brought up, Soni, how do you make a safe space for people to share? How do you make a safe space where people don't feel called out to be like, hey, you tell me your story about being an Indigenous person or being a Black person, but more that this is a space for me to share uncensored. And I don't really have the answer to that because I've been fumbling with it. You know, when we first started off in our work, we wanted to, you know, jumped on the reconciliation bandwagon. We're like, okay, let's have, you know, settler and non-settler Indigenous communities come together and talk. And then, you know, there's crickets. And then there's also oftentimes the conversation gets co-opted by settlers. And I thought, okay, the room is not safe. And so with COVID, we've taken a step back and going, okay, let's go into our own communities, because that's where we need to figure out what's going on in our minds, right? And I think if anything, we learned from the riots, but more the protests, that we're not going to stand for racism and systemic racism. And what we learned from George Floyd and people resisting is that we need to talk to each other and we need to congregate with each other. So I've been part of a lot of BIPOC playback theater conversations, and it's a lot of people describe racism in the fact that I have to censor myself in mixed company. And then when we're in this kind of like safe place to talk, we can actually start to unpack things. And that's kind of where my theater work is coming to, is I think we need some safe spaces to talk. And I don't know what all the exact definitions of how to create a safe space is, but I think part of it is that we need places where we can feel uncensored. We need a place where we don't feel like we have to measure our words because we're not sure who's listening. So
that's so powerful, and it ties nicely into what the three of you have spoken about in terms of violence, safety, healing, embodiment. Like, it really resonated with me about like that piece about how do you embody the pain of experiencing racism, and then going through a process to really acknowledge that and move through that and go to the collective to say, how can we collectively heal as well, right? So it's that process, which is excellent. Just moving to the next question, because I think it's a good segue. Often a lot of social service agencies, education, housing looks at trauma-based approach, right? But trauma-based approach sometimes is very negative, right? So in terms of like, when we look at the difference between trauma and strengths, how do we define that and how do we play with that? And, you know, we just had a question, I think, about asking them impacts of mental health on racism. So if you're framed when you look at it, the impacts of racism from a trauma-based or a strengths-based approach. Elliott, we'll start with you. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah. So I would say the difference for me, and I think from a strength-based approach, I thinking about this question before, I had a difficult time moving away from or making a difference between strength-based and kind of a growth mindset, or kind of like a grit mindset. And the problem, the challenge that I had with the strength-based or kind of like a growth mindset is from an article that was recently shared with me by one of my colleagues, and that when you think about a strength-based or kind of like a growth mindset, it doesn't take into consideration the barriers, the challenges, the effort that is needed by BIPOC community members that they encounter through the system and through systemic racism. And I think about this through like education, where assessments, just the simple thing of assessments, would be a challenge. It's inherently racist towards certain groups. And so how are you supposed to have a growth mindset or a strength-based when the way that the system is structured is already challenging? It is already kind of against you. The other side of that, the trauma-based approach, I feel like there's such an important, and it's really interesting how some of the things I'm chatting with today kind of all connect with each other, is that we were just recently talking about in a meeting earlier about trauma-based and a trauma-based approach, and a concept that we were talking about around cultural safety and the piece around understanding cultural safety, and this is great, where the people that we were working with kind of have done a lot of work leading up to the concept of cultural safety, and moving it from a concept that isn't about cultural awareness, isn't about understanding cultural issues or historical issues and current issues, but it's actually a process of understanding anti-oppressive practices and understanding trauma-informed care. And so when you understand that, when you're able to think about the trauma that that not only that person has experienced in their lifetime, but also intergenerational trauma, and how that is impacting their current being right now and their current life is so important, because whoever is interacting with that person has a certain amount of privilege. And especially with education, especially with Norquest, there is a power dynamic. There is privilege and there is power that comes from being a teacher, from being an instructor, from being an administrator within a school. And so if you don't have a trauma-informed approach, then you could be re-traumatizing people because you're requiring them to tell their story again. You might be, there's potential there for re-traumatization, and especially with the Indigenous community. And so understanding kind of anti-oppressive practices that allow you to be reflexive about your power, your privilege, your bias, and then to combine that with a trauma-informed approach is, I think, a better way of working with Indigenous communities. Specifically, it's not gonna, it potentially won't have that systemic, it won't resolve systemic issues, but at least with the individual level, in the sense of being able to address as much of those racist pieces with that individual interaction with that person, allows a better experience for that person within an institution that is historically racist and oppressive and violent. So then it allows another kind of a safe space for that person to connect with when encountering another system that is inherently oppressive. So.
Excellent. David or Lucy?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think these two approaches are mutually exclusive. Kind of like building on what Elliott's saying, we need to be trauma-informed or trauma-based to understand what's happened to people and what's happened to communities and what's happened intergenerationally, in order for us to build on the strengths, in order for us to know that where they're coming from, strengths look different for each person. If I understand the trauma that people have gone through, I'll understand some of their responses, and then I help normalize it. So if, what we'll see with a lot of students, for example, is that what some people might call self-sabotage. They might try to go to school and then they just pull out before the exam, or they, because they don't want to succeed, because part of their trauma response might be that fight, flight, or freeze. And then when we normalize that, go, hey, that might have been like a trauma response, people can kind of sit back and go, oh, okay. And then we can tap into their strength. Like, what did you do well during that time? And where can we go with, when you come into that fight, or freeze? So when we go through a trauma-based approach, we can start framing some of the different responses that people might have and start to see, like, that's the context of what's happened to you and what you might have done in the past. And now, you've been working on responding differently. So then we start looking at the strengths. We also can look at people's responses in trauma as a strength. And sometimes a more pathologizing ways that we start pathologizing, becoming personality traits or mental health disorders. But, anxiety is a response. It's a response to get us noticing what's going on. And so when we start to normalize these responses that our bodies are working to respond, then we could actually start tapping into strengths and working with what we have, working with where we're at in the moment in our own healing journey.
Mm-hmm. Having that reflexive self-knowledge is amazing, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And having people around us to also help us in acknowledging that too, so that we're not always the only ones being our own advocates, because that's taxing on people, especially BIPOC people. It's taxing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. David?
I think Elliott and Lucy really described well how there's that fine balance between the trauma-informed approach and the strengths-based approach. I kind of want to point out maybe one of the failings of the trauma-informed approach, at least in the housing sector, is that when we approach helping individuals who are homeless to find housing through the Housing First program, or to connect them to permanent supportive housing or whatnot, is we do use that trauma-informed lens, and it's a priority in the service that we offer. But it's not balanced with that strengths-based approach. We're taught how to do trauma-informed practice, how we need to recognize what's happened to people as a key factor in us determining how we help them. And of course, that's an important piece of what we understand, but we're not taught at the same time to build on people's strengths. Perhaps if you were working in psychology, psychiatry, counseling, support services, you'd have more of that training framed for you, because in that sector of services, it's more important to understand the balanced approach. But in housing, where we don't have as much of that intersection with the mental health system as we should, the strengths-based approach gets left behind. And it's becoming more prevalent for sure, particularly through community development, through asset-based programming with children and with community members. But then also, a lot of people's trauma when they experience racism can manifest, whether internally through poor mental health, or it can manifest to take that stress and that anger and that frustration and to start advocating and demanding social justice. And that can be very inspiring and a strength in and of itself. But at the same time, we also need to be cautious that people's experiences of racism, while they can build something strong out of that, can also re-traumatize, as Elliott mentioned. There's always the risk, and it's quite prevalent that the BIPOC community carries this conversation. It's their experiences of racism, it's their experiences of discrimination and systemic oppression that are the ones demanding we have these conversations. These conversations aren't happening in the settler community enough. So I think we have to be cautious not to capitalize on people's trauma as a strength, but at the same time recognize that each frames the other.
That's really beautiful how everybody has sort of said that it's on a continuum. It's not one or the other. It ebbs and flows depending on the situation and the context, and how people can actually come together to understand that and to be supportive. And I think that one of the things that I really want to bring back to, like the definition, mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So as we're talking about these pieces about not feeling safe, about experiencing violence, about experiencing microaggressions, our mental health is being jarred, right? Because like Lucy has indicated as well, anxiety is something that you experience when witnessing or experiencing racism, or witnessing and seeing a systemic racist occurrence happen, right? So personally for me, I'll just share this quickly before we move into the next question. I think that I didn't realize how much of an impact the media has on my psyche subconsciously. So 2 times in the past couple of years, I I was joking about Justin Trudeau being all black face, brown face. But then later on, it really impacted me because it impacted my child. My child came to me and said, Justin Trudeau hates brown people. And I'm like, wow, he got that from one clip on a newsreel, right? So for me, then I started thinking about how do I unpack this? And even just last week, a certain politician's comments about South Asian community in Calgary spreading COVID, like these kinds of aggressions that are coming through different forums are raising my anxiety, right? So as a person who is identified as a South Asian person. So when we talk about these complex notions of systemic, individual, maneuvering all of these pieces, finding safe space, negotiating, discussing, like it's so complex. So the next question would be, what key messages have you used to introduce and discuss the impacts of racism on mental health keeping in mind these complexities. It's not simple, right? Ta-da! Okay, David.
So I think some really important messages that we need to have around racism and how to affect us is that we need to approach this in a relational way. We can talk conceptually about how these concepts intersect, how they press us to achieve social justice, but without that relational piece and an empathetic approach, I think it's really difficult to unpack, as you put it, how these things intersect. And so just today, we're sitting here in a panel, we're having this guided conversation, and I think that is an example of a really good relational approach where we have created this safe space as best we can, and where we're able to actually share our thoughts, our feelings, our concerns around the topic in a very human way through conversation, right? And so that would be like one of my biggest messages. But another one that I think is really important is continually recognizing my own bias. We all come with our own bias. And so I'm a cis hetero male with European ancestry, second generation settler, who has a lot of bias, and I need to understand what those are. And I have to continuously challenge myself to learn from my experiences of bias, to learn from what other people are telling me when they notice that bias, or even just trying to recognize the unconscious bias. And I think that is a really important piece as well, is that until we can actually accept that we do have our own biases that really do affect how we treat other people, that we can't move beyond them.
Thank you, David. Elliott?
Yeah, I'm going to use some messaging that I've shared with and I'm sure other institutions are doing the same thing, and I referred to it just a little while ago around doing anti-racist initiatives, moving towards making your organization anti-racist, moving towards like a EDI or like equity, diversity, inclusion strategy. And the way that you do this, and the way that I've seen it, and the way that it's being done at Norquest, and one way to kind of have these conversations is creating or is that conducting like anti-racist circles and talking about a safe space and talking about creating a safe space. My messaging through that has been, just because you're saying you're creating a safe space does not make it safe. There's a lot of experiences, and this is where, like, just because you make a commitment to being anti-racist, or you move towards an EDI strategy, does not make, just because you announce it does not mean that you've attained it. And so you are working within a system that is already not safe, and especially with psychological safety. With psychological safety with colleagues, the amount of work and the amount of mental and emotional energy that it takes for somebody of the BIPOC community to jump on board, say like an anti-racist initiative, and like to participate in circles, there's a lot of work that is being done by those people individually just to step into that space, because they know that they're going to be asked to share their opinions. They're going to be asked to share their experiences. They're going to be asked to provide information or provide their guidance. But on the other side of it, and this is where it may not be a popular thing to say, but they're asked to hear the stories of white guilt. That's the only way I can say it, is that you're getting into conversations where you're getting into a space where you have to willingly put yourself in a space where you're gonna talk about what you're feeling, and talk about the experiences you had with racism, but you're gonna have to hear about how some people's transformation to white guilt is moving them into a space where they're starting to talk about their privilege, starting to talk about their power, starting to talk about their bias. And so all of that is so taxing on mental and emotional energy. And when I talk about this with the impacts of racism on mental health with this, is that when we're doing this, know that you're not starting from zero, that you're starting from a place that is brand new. There's a lot of history within institutions, and especially, and I go back to it again, education is very much an oppressive, violent thing for a lot of BIPOC community members. So that needs to be taken into account. And then and this is where I'm very interested in data and how we're gonna cover this with data, is that there's gonna be people that are gonna be participating who isn't participating, whose voices are we not hearing because they didn't get up to that point of being like, okay, I can manage the mental and emotional energy that it's gonna take to get into the space, and I feel safe enough to do that. Some people are gonna be like, no, I've done this before, I don't feel safe, I'm not gonna participate. Then what's happening with that? Like how are we making sure that their voice in some way is being heard by that institution? Right now, they're not. So we're working through that as an institution, but that's one of the messages that I share around moving towards this work that is going to be very challenging on BIPOC staff, BIPOC community members, and moving this stuff forward. Yeah.
I really admire that you have put that on the table, because you're right. Like, I think when we talk about historic systemic racism, we have to recognize that Canada was built on white settler privilege and supremacy, right? So that has to also be embedded in our understanding. Lucy?
Yes, there's so much that happens collectively that we need to acknowledge what Black, Indigenous people of color are carrying when it comes to the impacts of witnessing racism, seeing it in our media, and how it affects them. And I think one of my key messages as a therapist and as an artist is, come as you are, and I don't pretend to know what your experience is. And I'm going to be humble to listen to where you're at, how you particularly experience the impacts of racism. And so in therapy, I help externalize it and contextualize what's happening and what they're experiencing, and validate that these are reactions that are normal when you are dealing with something violent and aggressive to your system and your own being. And I think that helps relieve people, because they don't want to see themselves as angry, or they don't want to see themselves as like, not valuing their colleagues, but they want to acknowledge that, yeah, it's hard to hear white guilt. It's hard to take on this role to educate your colleagues or educate your the people that you are trying to work and live with together. And then on a community level, I'm really understanding the value of having separate spaces to create safety. And that, what David had said is that, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people are really used to talking to each other. They're used to having these circles and talking about these issues. We talk about race all the time because we walk on the street and people see us, and then we've experienced something. And this is not an occurrence that white people experience. And so I think one of the key messages when I'm trying to create spaces in the theater world is like, hey, I'm making a space for us, and I think sellers have to start making spaces for them, and they have to self-organize, and they have to start doing the work so that we can do this collaborative discussion, because we can't carry the weight anymore. We have to do this collectively, and it's not okay to ask us to be the leaders for all these discussions. The work has to be done on both sides, multiple sides.
Yes. multiple
sides. Multiple slides.
Wow, I'm just sighing. This is like so profoundly heavy, but also very healing. So let's keep on moving. We have about 5 minutes left before we move into question and from the audience. So I just like to wrap up with the last question. If you guys could folks could very succinctly give me a good practice model that you have developed to use to support the mental health of individuals or communities experiencing mental health due to experience of racism. Like, what is your go-to good practice or something that you've developed or created that really has worked with your population? Yeah, rapid fire round. Sorry. Elliott?
Okay, I'll try to be short. The way that, and it just happened kind of organically with the space that I'm in at Norquest, that creating a space, not an actual physical space, but just a space for me and my Indigenous colleagues to have a space to talk about these issues. It's one of those things that, like, because there's only so many times that you can say something until you come to a point of like, am I saying, like, am I being too critical? And I start questioning myself, and because at times I'm the only Indigenous person in the room, and I'm like, am I being just a little too critical? Am I just being too difficult? And then to have that community, to have that space to share those type of experiences with colleagues and being like, no, thank you for sharing that, thank you for being that voice. And it's not even just me, I'm not saying thank you to me, I'm saying like thank you to like my colleagues when they do share that. I'm like, thank you for sharing that. And I understand how much energy it takes for you to amplify your voice in that. And so being able to have a space to have those conversations and with people that, and this one's specifically with my Indigenous colleagues, that's one thing that I've and it just happened organically. It's turned into a space that all of us feel very comfortable in sharing our experiences and sharing our challenges and the barriers that we have to the work, and then kind of building that kind of community support that way.
Intentional space is always very important. Thank you. David?
Pretty much building on what Elliott said, I think that's actually very key, is this peer-driven circle space where you can have these conversations, and kind of building on what Lucy said, we do as white settlers need to have these conversations in our own, to divest the burden from the BIPOC community. And particularly in some of the work that E4C has been doing with peer support, we do predominantly serve a white middle class through our mental health programs at the Wellness Network, for example. And one time we had a young Indigenous woman join us, and she expressed her frustration with how we expressed our lack of understanding around Indigenous protocols and Indigenous culture. And of course, when she didn't come back, that prompted us to have a conversation about what is our responsibility to learn about other cultures and to learn about what happens in the community for those cultures, and how does that intersect with what we do in the community. We're using a traditional circle format in a lot of the peer work that we do. And so that does have some traditional Indigenous perspective to it. And so we certainly want to learn from an Indigenous community or from BIPOC communities about their culture, but we really don't know how. And we have to figure that out. We have to learn how to be respectful when we connect with others of different cultures. We have to be open to learning different cultural competencies and not expecting token participation or just checking off all the boxes of what protocols we've done, whether that's land acknowledgements or offering tobacco or other things. And so it's really important to have that peer conversation, kind of how Elliott said, for him, it's important to have that Indigenous community of peers to connect with. And I think that type of conversation is going to be hard for us white settlers, and it continues to be so, but we need to start doing it more and more and more.
Yes, I appreciate the tokenism comment, because sometimes unbeknownly, this is what happens. But to be really diligent, to be intentional and avoid that would be really good. Lucy?
I just have to appreciate David being able to like position himself and to like take on that role as a settler and to name it. I think I would like to see more of that. You know, I'd like to see more collaboration. So we're at that point where like you and I can be like, let's sit down and talk, and like now we can collaborate, right? And I think that's what I want to see more of in general. And I think the best practices that I've learned is that self-reflexivity, and that we only create that self-reflexivity when we have that positive support network within ourselves. So I have a group of BIPOC therapists that I get to talk to and work with, and when we talk about these issues of racism, and the same thing in my theater community. And that really helps me just kind of ground in, yes, is this the reality that we're experiencing, and kind of the reality checking, so that we all kind of confer. In terms of my practice, I started in my private practice. Now that I have like a chance to kind of focus on who I want to work with, I've really made it a point to give space for BIPOC individuals in my therapy practice. I just, you know, there's lots of therapists out there. They do wonderful things. They're amazing in lots of different skilled practices. And I realize, like, if I want to offer something, I'm going to focus in on my lived experience. And that's something I learned working with Indigenous communities, is that a skilled elder does is they use their story in a way that serves the community. And so I think that's kind of the best practice that I've picked up, is how can I use my own lived experience to serve my community, and situate myself in my own experience and not in anyone else's, and value that, and value the fact that this is my body, this is my racialized body, and this is what I've lived with. And how can I support other people in understanding their own situatedness?
Thank you so much. That was so like brave and beautiful and wonderful. All of you have shared really profound learnings and ideas to be able to move forward. And I hope that the people that are witnessing this webinar have taken some points to move forward in their journeys with understanding the impacts of racism on mental health. I'm going to move into some questions that have come up from the audience that are linked to this conversation. So the first question is, I struggle with a dilemma in my work and social life. How can I talk of race, racial belonging, ethnicity, and avoid contributing to racist discourse? This is really a challenge because liberal politics and discourse encourage us to avoid talk of race and race labels. But we know race, racial labels, division, biases remain very real and present. Totally torn how to talk on this minefield of a topic. So I think that a couple of things that came to mind listening to you all was the intentionality, right? So if you're going to be talking about an EDI strategy, I really think it's important to name racism and to name the impacts and the experience of racial communities that we've all been saying. And also to, as David has located himself, to really locate yourself in power, privilege, and status as a white settler or a white person, cisgendered, like David had said. That's one way of actually, I think, observing and helping unpack some of that. But I'd like to hear what our panelists have to say as well.
Coming back to the places of safety, I think sometimes we want to like respond to the most overt things that we find difficult, like our work setting, right? We want to be in a work setting where we treat people kindly and have a good place to work. And maybe that's not always the safest place to start. And so, you know, who are the people in our lives that we could start having that conversation safely? And then we can move on to, you know, more challenging conversations. And so, like I mentioned earlier, for people who are racialized, you know, it's fairly common that we talk about these things because it happens often. And so if you don't feel that you might experience that too often, then then start to look and reflect on like, how do I walk in this world and what am I taking for granted? And maybe I can talk to someone who also might experience in the same way. And then we can start talking about, you know, the more challenging things that you talked about, race, racial belonging, ethnicity. And like what Soni said, situate in yourself, because, you know, when you live from your own experience, you know, people can't deny that part or can't call you out as, like, you know, being racist when you're living within your own, you know, reality. And sometimes we need to talk with that fumbling, because we don't really know all the language and the words. And so finding a safe place is the start. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Excellent. I'm just going to move on to some other, because we have quite a few questions. So, okay, I'll just read this one. Thank you for sharing your stories and experiences. It has really opened my eyes to specific situations and struggles. I'm half Caucasian, half is minority, and I struggle with both white guilt as well as issues that face others in the BIPOC community, as I can relate to both. How can I reconcile these feelings? How can I relate to others? I wonder how they would perceive me. So I think that's complex, right? Like, because it's like walking in two different worlds, but also being in the same world and negotiating those complex pieces. So I think embodying experiences, again, like Lucy has mentioned, finding healing therapies that help you find your voice. It's difficult, but like, what is that pathway sometimes that you need to forge to find that support, right? Anyone else?
This is an interesting one to me, because I how can I frame this? I thank you for the question, first off, and the thing that it gets me thinking about is potentially my kids asking me the same thing. Their mom is non-Indigenous. She is white. She's a settler, and I'm Indigenous. So they're technically status Indian, but there's a whole other side of them that connects to settler Canadians. And so how you get me thinking about a question that I'm most likely going to have to answer later, and I don't have a good answer right now. I'm like, I better start thinking about this more. But then it gets me thinking about how when I grew up, I have both my feet. I am First Nation. My mom's from Sultana down south. I'm Dene from my mom's side and Cree from my dad's side. But I grew up on reserve and I went to school off reserve. And the amount of times that I got called an apple or a potato, if any of you don't know what that is, it means like red on the outside, white on the inside type of thing. It's hard to reconcile those feelings and to understand how racist that is, and to understand that it's from your own community as well. It wasn't the settler kids that were calling me that. Those are my friends, my cousins that were calling me. And so it's tough. It's really tough to reconcile that. And then from the other side of it, because I was in town school, and like all the people from my community were on the streets in the community. They were perceived to be kind of street drunk, all those things. They would call me the exception, and I grew to welcome that. And then it wasn't until later that I realized that was extremely racist too. Like it's interesting to navigate identity and navigate kind of your race, I guess, yeah, but your identity, and reflect on that, and consistently reflect on that, and what it means for you, and how you use that to inform how you move forward. So yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have a great answer, but at the same time, I think I need to get one for my kids. So thank you for prompting that question.
And I think you raised a good point about identity, right? So Canada is all about identities, right? Because we have a multicultural policy, we have a colonial history, we have like a legacy of the British and French colonizing our nation. But before that, there were so many diverse like, and still are diverse Indigenous populations, and the whole history of immigration of different people coming from different places. So this is why it's so complex as well, because of the nature of our population and the nature of our history. And I think that some of the questions that are also emerging is like, where do we land our feet and negotiate and unpack all those layers, right? So, so I think that that's another piece that really will be coming up more, because, like, for example, Elliot, as you have shared, my husband is Jamaican Black, and my parents are from India historically, so I'm South Asian. My children too, like, they're biracial, but they don't appear to be biracial. Sometimes they're Black presenting, sometimes they're brown presenting, or however I see it. So they are also reconciling and renegotiating those things every single moment, every single day, in different formats, right? So I think that how we started this discussion about anxiety triggers, or successful ways of finding healing pathways or ecosystems, or negotiating space, psychological safety, like, all of these aspects play into the way that we understand the impacts of racism on mental health. And I think that a lot of questions sometimes are people looking at, oh, well, what about this kind of history? Well, I think it's important to understand Canadian history, and we ourselves as Canadians, or people who are settling in Canada or have been here for time immemorial, need to understand our own history and our relativity to that, to also, like, understand where we can also embody these different things and build out these different spaces, right? Because I feel like a lot of the questions too come from that inquiry of identity as well, right? Um, okay, so I think that we have about 10 more minutes left.
I want to
Before,
comment on something.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead, Sonny.
Yeah, no, it's really good.
Something from the chat. It's really hard. I must say this, by the end of these kinds of conversations, it's like kind of like a little bit challenging because we're dealing with multiple realities all at once. But something from the chat and from this last question was, someone was in the chat was asking, are you talking about light colored skin people? Because we're all varied people, right? And so I want to just name that we're talking about constructs here. We're not talking about specific cultural groups that white presenting. And so and this is kind of like a bigger conversation to talk about, but Resmaa Menakem, who's a therapist, a Black therapist in the States, has written a book called My Grandmother's Hands on Racialized Trauma. And he talks about white body supremacy and police bodies and Black bodies. And he talks about them on a neurological level and how we respond and how we experience racism in our bodies. And so although I'm Chinese Vietnamese, I also embody white body supremacy. I have grown up in Canada. I know what the structures are. I know how to play those structures, and I play them to my advantage. That's how I use my privilege. And so when we're talking about white people, I don't want people to feel like in the audience that we're targeting people in often I might hear the comment in chats is like, you're being racist against white people. But racism is when you have privilege and you're using it against people who don't have privilege. And so when we're commenting on white body supremacy, we're talking about the structure of that perpetuates racism against people who don't have privilege in certain situations. And how we live that, how do we reconcile that when we have that in our bodies? And there's not a defined answer, but it is that we have to start recognizing how we embody it and how we perpetuate it. And then once we understand that, then we can start to address it in a way very with intention, in whether it's in school, whether it's therapy, whether it's in housing. We need to understand how it's perpetuated within our own bodies. So if everyone's interested in understanding how that perpetuates in our own bodies, I mean, that's a lovely book to kind of center, that these are lived experiences, and that reconciling is challenging. It is hard. It's within ourselves.
Can you repeat the name? Because somebody asked to type it into the chat.
Oh yeah. Okay, Resmaa Menakem. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead.
I kind of want to build on what Lucy's saying, and I also noticed there was a comment in the chat about white guilt and the problem with that terminology, and I mean, for myself, I genuinely don't feel white guilt. I think that I have a lot of white privilege where I'm at. But I think that kind of how Lucy mentioned that white body experience and how we've been conditioned to grow into Canadian culture with its white supremacist norms. Some of us might feel very bad about not recognizing that within ourselves, or not being able to reconcile our goodness and appreciation for other race and culture because of our white experience. But the reason I don't feel white guilt is that I'm open to learning about all other cultures. I grew up loving Black culture and hip hop. I grew up loving anime and other Japanese culture, and I want to learn more about all the different cultures. Um, I know a lot of elders who have actually been very fortunate to get teachings from. And so for me, it's not about having white guilt in reconciling my white privilege. It's about wanting to learn how to be a better person and how to connect with others of different races and cultures, and not get bogged down by this self-identity that is detrimental to who I am. But at the same time, recognizing that white body experience that Lucy had mentioned, that it is inherently a part of who I am, and I can't change that. But I can certainly change the way that I approach how I deal with others.
And I think that's part of the complexity, right? Because systemically, when we talk about systemic racism, the white body normative is in our legislation, it's in our policies, in our programs, in the way that we walk through life in Canada, in Edmonton, in Alberta. So I think that that is the fine line then when we move into individual experiences. So how do you, on like sort of a spectrum or a spiral, like do that dance and understand your knowledge of that, your openness to this, your willingness, like you said earlier, to have social justice and change, to really understand the barriers and the impacts on mental health and the embedded structural racist barriers that are there, and trying to really chip away those while still functioning in an individual level. So it's not like siloed. I think it's like a continuum. And sometimes when we talk about these issues, they tend to be talked about as silos, but they're part of a whole holistic experience, right? And that's the complexity, because there's so many things depending on where you're situated and what you're experiencing in the education, in the housing, in therapy, or just in interacting with different systems or individuals even, right? Yeah, so I really appreciate our talk. I just wanted to give the opportunity for Lucy, Elliott, and David to end with one maybe thought or parting words of wisdom.
Maybe I can start. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much, Soni, for inviting me. Thank you, David and Lucy, for allowing me to contribute to the conversation as well, and hearing the amazing stuff that you've shared. Thank you. The last thing I guess I want to share is that we're all on paths with our own mental health and what we're doing. So it's important to reach out when you can, access supports when you can. I'm going to share, Lucy, that like, it's funny where I was asked, and the panel members were all shared like who all the panel members were, and then a photo was shared of Lucy, and I'm like, how do I recognize Lucy from somewhere? And then I'm just like, oh, right, yes, I accessed her services through my employment and family assistance program. Whereas like, it's so important to access support, and making sure that you, and this is where I want to normalize mental health, the importance of managing your mental health and accessing support when you can and when you need it. And and it's just amazing how everything's kind of connected, and it's great to connect with Lucy again in this way. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, maybe just to complement that is mental health is not a breaking point and then we seek services. Mental health is like continuum, like you said, we always have to take care of it, and taking care of each other is also part of that. And so that means, you know, when we hear a microaggression at work, when we see something happen to our friends, you know, when the protests were happening, I checked in with my people of color friends. I checked in on them. How are you doing? What's going on for you? I didn't wait for them to tell me that this was terrible. This was heart-wrenching. I want to check in with them and see how's this settling with you? Because it's not settling with me. And so I think we need to do more of that before it gets to the point where we feel like there's no one else to talk to. I think I have a role as a therapist to be like, okay, when it's time to talk, let's have this sacred space to talk and focus. And then I think in our day-to-day lives, mental health is all of our responsibilities. And so we check in with people and see how people are settling in. And so that those are the moments, like the question was, how can I talk about this at work? Well, when you see something happening and you were frozen because you were in that fight, flight, or freeze, maybe check in with your colleague and I heard that, did that settle in well with you? Like, what can I do to help? Yeah, that's my final comment.
Thank you, David.
Well, I think part of people's mental health journey is also learning to live with the struggles and the discomfort of things that are adverse to positive living, to wellness. And it's not fair to expect people to have to live with that adversity and to live with that stressor, but I think that part of our own mental health journeys requires us to be able to face that struggle in the eye, and to understand that these are not going to be easy conversations, and they're not going to magically improve if we have the right process, whether that's therapy or getting all the social determinants of health met for us to achieve wellness. I think we're all going to encounter the struggle and the difficulty of these conversations. And while I wouldn't want to burden anyone with that, I think that is something we need to recognize, is that these are not easy conversations to have. But in the end, once we're able to actually move into a place that we can have these conversations, there's so many powerful things that we can learn and grow from, which will help us with our mental health. And so I want to recognize that there are so many things that can help us to form positive mental health. But I do want to recognize that some of that does include being able to face those demons within us and within our communities in an honest and open way.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm so happy to see your lovely faces and to share this space with you. And I just quickly, before I wrap up, I would like to also share that if people are interested, YEG Wellness Collective and City and Soul Wellness, I'm hosting some BIPOC healing circles there. If people want to come in and join on this continuing conversation, I welcome you to join. And Miriam is reminding me to remind all of you, please give feedback to the session. We'd be very grateful. And just as a last note, I think that this is an ongoing journey, and we really need to be committed to, taking care of, like our panelists have said, our own mental health, but our collective mental health. And when we are able to have that strength, really challenging status quo's stereotypes and societal boxes about what mental health should be, right? I'll leave it with that, and I'll turn it over to Miriam to close the session. And thank you so much, CFRAG, for this amazing opportunity to share this with you and with our guests.
Thank you so much, Soni, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists today. That was an incredibly important conversation to have, and I feel very humbled and very grateful to be part of this, because I learned so much from all of you. So thank you very much. Thank you also for everyone in our who joined us as an audience today. We are always very happy to see how many people are interested in our conversations. And this is our last roundtable for this year, but we will pick it up again come January. So please stay tuned. And we would be very grateful, as Soni has said, if you would please provide us with your feedback and any suggestions you may have, any comments. It's always very helpful for us. So thank you so much, and I wish you all a good rest of the year. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you early next year. Take care.